Bradley roared, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Here I decide who counts as human and who's just trash." His dry, guttural laugh echoed as if it meant to swallow the entire auditorium. Evelyn wiped the blood away and replied slowly, "Your power survives only because others are too afraid to stand up. I'm not one of them." The air detonated, the audience froze, and social media waited for a single tap to ignite. Early in the morning, light rain fell on the stone steps of the courthouse, each tiny drop casting a cold gray hue that made the already still air feel even more stifling. The rain tapped steadily on the stone, a ticking rhythm, like a clock counting down to a confrontation no one could fully anticipate. The chill seeped through layers of clothing into the skin of those waiting in the courtyard, forcing them into silence, their eyes fixed on the couple slowly approaching. Michael Carter, in a dark suit, wore a firm but heavy expression, his eyes locked forward without a hint of hesitation. His hands were steady on the wheelchair handles, pushing the woman he loved, Evelyn Carter. Evelyn sat upright, her back gently resting against the cushion. Her face was pale from prolonged pain, but her eyes were not. They were deep, bright, and sharp, as if the wind and rain outside were no more than a fragile curtain, incapable of smothering the quiet fire burning within. The wheels of the chair scraped against the damp stone, merging with the rain's patter into a strange cadence that sounded like a quiet declaration of presence too strong to ignore. The couple reached the grand steps, where the heavy wooden courthouse doors remained shut. In front of them stood Officer Bradley, unmoving like a wall. His broad shoulders and towering frame projected an invisible pressure. He said nothing, barely moved, only tapped his finger in a steady rhythm against the polished gold badge pinned to his chest. The faint metallic sound blended with the rain, a cold reminder of the power he held. That badge caught the dim morning light and flickered like a blunt, persistent blade, cutting quiet slits into the atmosphere. Bradley didn't need to shout or show off. That small act alone made it clear he saw this place as his domain, and anyone passing through would bow to the authority worn on his chest. Bradley's eyes dropped, sweeping over Michael, as if assessing something beneath him, then landing on Evelyn's face. In his gaze was clear disdain, as if she were a meaningless obstacle. The corner of his mouth curled into a smirk full of provocation. "That skin color doesn't give you any extra worth in our court," he said, each word sharp and deliberate, as if etched into the stone floor, demanding everyone nearby hear it. The crowd stayed silent. A few furrowed their brows, but no one spoke. Bradley's presence was like a blade hanging overhead, making everyone wary, unwilling to resist. Michael tightened his grip on the handles, feeling every tendon in his hands stretch, ready to snap back against the blatant insult. But he stayed silent because Evelyn was still sitting there, her eyes fixed on Bradley. She lifted her face, a few raindrops clinging to her forehead, and hair sliding down her cheeks and blending into the pallor of her skin, but her gaze remained steady. She didn't lower her head or let the mockery shake her. Her eyes seemed to cut through the hollow shell of Bradley's authority, and for a brief second the smirk on his lips faltered. Evelyn spoke, her voice low but clear, each word striking like a hammer on the cold stone. "Dignity is not something you get to measure by skin color." The words were sharp, unshaken, like a blow that silenced the space around them. In that moment, the invisible line suddenly appeared. On one side stood power built on a shiny badge, and a habit of intimidation on the other, the calm strength of a woman who refused to be measured by bias. In Evelyn's gaze, Bradley felt a wall rising, keeping him from touching her belief. He frowned, stopped tapping his badge, his palm now oddly heavy, and the confidence in his eyes gave way to a flicker of unease. He was used to fear, used to pleading, but now he faced a gaze as cold as ice, not filled with panic, but a silent resistance that irritated him. The sound of the wheelchair resumed. Michael pushed his wife forward a little farther. The people around them began to move inside footsteps, echoing down the long hallway that led to the courtroom. The murmurs mixed with the rain, thickening the air, and everyone sensed something was about to erupt. Evelyn's gaze stayed razor sharp. Michael walked slowly but firmly, while Bradley clenched his jaw, his breathing heavier, as if the game he knew was slipping out of his control. Outside, the contrast sharpened. The rain grew heavier, each drop breaking apart on the stone steps, flowing into small streams as if washing away the pretense. The gray sky revealed no light, but in Evelyn's eyes there was a clarity that made it obvious the sun wasn't the only thing that defined a day. It was people who stood upright in the dark. Michael felt the blood rush in his veins, his heart pounding with every turn of the wheels. He knew this day wasn't just a trial. It was the day his wife would cross the fragile line between survival and truth, a line that Bradley had unknowingly drawn with his own spite. A gust of wind swept through, carrying the chill of moisture and making people hunch their shoulders. Bradley still stood in the way, but Evelyn's silence pressed down on him, pushing him to lash out with something even more cutting. Yet her words lingered, forcing him to realize that not everyone feared the badge. The crowd glanced at one another, subtle looks passing between them, and more eyes turned toward Evelyn. Some surprised, some impressed, but most of all curious. A woman in a wheelchair, pale and worn, yet capable of speaking with such unflinching defiance. The rain, the sound of wheels, the tapping of the badge all had stopped, folding into a scene heavy with weight. The line between justice and hollow power had been drawn right there on the cold courthouse steps. And from that moment on, everyone knew that what was about to happen inside would not be an ordinary trial. Bradley could still stand there, still believe he held control, but Evelyn had already sown something into the air, a quiet resistance that made the entire system tremble, even if no one dared to say it aloud. The courthouse hallway stretched endlessly, the fluorescent lights above flickering on and off, exposing patches of gray-stained walls. The sound of shoes hitting the hollow tile floor echoed coldly like a drumbeat warning of something ominous ahead. The damp air of the old building clung to them, a mix of aged paper, rotting wood, and stale cigarette smoke lingering on the peeling paint. Michael Carter pushed his wife's wheelchair forward step by step, his hands gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles turned white, eyes locked on the path ahead, trying to stay calm. Evelyn Carter sat still, her sharp eyes quietly scanning the surroundings, unfazed by the chill creeping through every corner. All they could hear was the harsh scrape of the wheelchair wheels on the tile, a dry sound cutting through the thick air like a blade. Bradley followed close behind, his heavy footsteps pounding the floor as if to crush it. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it casually, then took a deep drag, filling the hallway with smoke as if to claim the space. He moved up beside the wheelchair, leaned in low, letting his smoky breath fill the small gap between him and Evelyn. "I've ended the military dreams of 3 black men. You'll be the 4th, he said, voice hoarse, dragging each word out like a dull blade scraping stone, slow and deliberate, to let the contempt sink in. The reek of smoke mingled with his dry tone, shrinking the hallway around them, all the flickering light above seeming to draw in on his cruel face. Michael jerked the handle sharply, his body tensed like a spring ready to snap. His eyes flared with long-held fury, muscles taut, arms trembling with rage. He wanted to break free of the restraint holding him back, to strike the man taunting them, but Evelyn's hand rested lightly on his arm and stopped him. It wasn't a tight grip nor a pleading gesture, just a soft touch, but strong enough to hold back the storm rising inside Michael. He looked down and met his wife's eyes, not burning with anger, but cold enough to chill the blood. Evelyn sat up straighter, her shoulders steady, her gaze sharp as a thin blade aimed directly at Bradley. No yelling, no wild reaction, just composure strong enough to calm her husband, to keep his fury in check, and stop this moment from becoming a reckless move. Bradley heard no pleading, no trace of the familiar fear he usually found in others' eyes. What he got instead was a chilling silence, a cold composure he wasn't used to facing. He took another drag from his cigarette, exhaled smoke directly into Evelyn's face, hoping she would flinch, hoping she would struggle. But Evelyn didn't move, her eyes still locked on his, seeming to pierce through the haze to expose the man behind it. He shifted uncomfortably. His hand trembled slightly, holding the cigarette, his lips forcing out a mocking smile, but something unfamiliar twisted inside him, an unease he couldn't shake. The hallway air grew tighter. The fluorescent lights crackled and blinked, casting flickering shadows of the three of them on the wall, stretched and warped. Michael remained behind the wheelchair, one hand on his wife's shoulder, his chest rising and falling as he swallowed down waves of rage. Evelyn stayed silent, but her silence wasn't weak. It was thick, sharp, pressing down until Bradley could no longer feel in control. That silence was like a blade cutting through his arrogance, making him itch like ants crawling inside his skull with no way to scratch. Bradley was used to begging voices, used to frightened eyes that looked away to people trembling when he closed in. But now in front of him sat a frail black woman in a wheelchair, not blinking, not bowing, only staring straight at him with eyes like ice. That quiet defiance made him snap with frustration, his laugh dry and forced, not the laugh of someone in command, but one dragged out of discomfort. He slammed his boot down on the tile, the loud crack echoing through the corridor as if he could shatter the air between them. But the weight of the moment only grew heavier. For that instant, the hallway became a battlefield. On one side, the threat of brute force cloaked in smoke and the arrogance of a man used to standing above others. On the other hand, a cold silence, no raised voice, no lifted hand, yet powerful enough to unsettle its target. Evelyn sat still, but her presence turned the wheelchair into a throne untouched by the stench of intimidation. She kept her gaze on him, unwavering, making it clear there are things that cannot be threatened, people who cannot be broken by fear. Bradley took one final drag, flicked the cigarette to the floor, and crushed it beneath his heel, leaving behind a smudge like a mark of his authority. But when he looked up, Evelyn's eyes were still there, calm and bright, and something in him twisted again. Anger, unease, something he couldn't name. In that brief second, he realized the threat he had spoken of hadn't inspired fear. It had exposed how hollow he truly was. The long hallway still echoed with footsteps, the turning of wheelchair wheels, and the soft popping of flickering fluorescent lights. But in Bradley's mind, all sound was drowned out by the terrifying silence of the woman before him. Evelyn didn't need to say another word yet. It was that silence that cornered him. He was used to instilling fear, but today he was the one unsettled, faced with a quiet defiance that left him with nowhere to go. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, the hinges groaning with a harsh, drawn-out sound like a crack splitting through the peak of tension in the air. White light spilled from the ceiling fixtures inside, pouring onto the rain-slick stone floor, forming a long beam like a cold blade pointed at the footsteps about to cross it. Michael Carter paused for a second, his hands tightening on the wheelchair handles, his chest pounding, knowing he and his wife were about to enter a place where there would be no room for mercy. Evelyn Carter sat still, one frail hand resting lightly on her thigh, her eyes fixed forward, showing no fear or hesitation, the pupils sharp and lit like two spears hidden behind a thin mask. Bradley stepped ahead, his movements, heavy shoulders and jaw clenched like a man ready to strike. His face held no space for restraint, veins bulged at his temples, and the muscles around his mouth twitched with each rapid heartbeat. His hand hovered near the gun at his hip, fingers tapping the holster like an addict, unable to let go of the tool that fed his authority. Inside the courtroom, a murmur stirred, then quickly faded as Bradley stopped in front of the wheelchair, the entire room seeming to collapse into a vacuum where only the jagged breath of each person could be heard. Bradley's eyes scanned Evelyn from head to toe, not in passing, but with the ruthless scrutiny of an interrogation. He stared at her pale face, met her unflinching gaze, then glanced at the wheelchair and lingered on the small hands resting gently on her lap. A twisted smile flickered across his lips, not joy, but the smug thrill of someone who believed the person before him was defenseless. A long silence stretched, slicing through the air, as every gaze in the room locked on the two at its center, one holding the power and one seated and unmoving, though her eyes refused to dim. Suddenly, Bradley's arm swung. The slap came fast and hard, sharp enough that those nearby heard the wind cut through the narrow space. The sound cracked through the courtroom as his heavy hand struck Evelyn's cheek, a blow that rang out like a whip on cold steel. It didn't just hit a woman's face, it struck at the trust of everyone present, leaving the room stunned in a breathless instant. Michael jerked forward. His chest seized his whole body, ignited as if someone had poured fuel on a fire. He lunged, but his hands clung tight to the back of the wheelchair. Evelyn's head had turned to the side, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. A drop of bright red blood slid down her chin, dripping onto her shirt and spreading into a dark stain on the fabric. But Evelyn's eyes were different. They didn't waver, didn't sink under the weight of the slap. They burned brighter, flaring like a fuse catching flame, turning the room cold as a heavy pressure swept in, making even those in the back rows shiver. She slowly raised her face, her gaze piercing into Bradley, forcing him to step back half a pace as if reflected by a challenge too fierce to ignore. The crowd in the courtroom held its breath. Someone covered their mouth. Another's eyes widened as if they had just witnessed something forbidden. No sound dared rise. Everyone froze in horror. Bradley still stood there, the hand he had slapped burning hot, but the smug satisfaction he had first felt was gone, replaced by a nameless confusion. He hadn't expected the slap to fail. Instead of breaking her, it had sparked something fiercer. Evelyn said nothing, yet her silence echoed louder than any voice shaking the courtroom walls, making it clear to all that a line had just been violently torn open before their eyes. Michael nearly sprang forward, but his wife's gaze turned to him and held him back. It wasn't pleading nor desperate, just firm, a silent command that stopped him in his tracks. His fist clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms, blood rushing through him, but he knew he couldn't act. This moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to Evelyn, to the eyes now locked with the man who had dared strike her in front of them all. Bradley exhaled a strained breath, his eyes scanning the courtroom and meeting hundreds of stares aimed directly at him. A few murmurs began to spread, but no one dared speak aloud. The room remained tight with shock. He swallowed hard and tried to force a smile, but the tension in his face betrayed a man on the edge of losing control. Evelyn tilted her head, blood still trailing from the corner of her mouth, but her posture stayed upright, eyes locked on him, with a look so fixed he couldn't turn away. The room thickened. The sound of beating hearts filled the air like a chaotic symphony. Someone in the back row dropped a pen. It hit the floor with a light tap, yet the echo of it seemed to reach every ear in the courtroom, making the silence heavier still. Bradley wanted to speak, to shout, to break the silence, but his throat clenched as if an invisible hand gripped it tight. Evelyn slowly raised her hand, wiped the blood from her lip, then lowered it again, her eyes still steady, sharp like an arrow aimed straight at him. The gesture was simple, yet it declared everything. The slap hadn't broken her, it had only revealed the strength inside. The people in the courtroom looked at one another, their eyes filled with shock, anger, but above all, a sense of anticipation. They were waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see whether the woman would fall or rise to meet what had just hit her. And under the flickering white light stretched across the stone floor, the answer was already clear. Evelyn Carter was not someone who would bow her head, not a victim who would suffer in silence, but a flame, ready to ignite from the very blow Bradley thought would extinguish her. In that moment, the courtroom, a place meant for rules and order, turned into an arena of stares and defiance. Bradley, with his heavy slap, believed he had humiliated his opponent, but in truth, he had only pushed himself into defeat. Evelyn, with a streak of bright red at the corner of her mouth, had become a symbol of resistance that could not be broken. No one spoke yet. The silence was building into a violent wave, one ready to burst beyond these walls and let the world know that justice had just been challenged by a brazen slap in the very place meant to uphold it. The wooden benches in the courtroom felt unusually heavy, the air so thick that even the sound of people breathing was sharp and distinct. Bradley's slap still seemed to echo off the stone walls, its dry, brutal aftermath freezing every eye on the moment just past. A law student near the front trembled so hard that the pen on his desk fell with a faint clatter, rolling across the tile floor. That small sound echoed through the silent room like an alarm bell. He bent to retrieve it, but his hand shook. Instead of grabbing the pen, he unlocked his phone, turned on the camera, and aimed the lens directly at the scene unfolding. The gesture came without hesitation, as if instinct demanded that this truth be recorded, not swallowed by the silence of four walls. Whispers spread like ripples ripples from a few gasps to a rising tide of hushed voices. "Did he just slap her?" a middle-aged woman stammered to the person beside her, her voice shaky, eyes wide in disbelief. "A woman in a wheelchair." The question burst like a spark in dry grass racing across every row. Heads leaned together, whispers multiplied, each one a blade slicing into the silence. In that moment, the courtroom turned into a sea of eyes, all focused on Bradley, not with obedience but with horror and outrage. Bradley still stood at the center like a man who believed he had just claimed victory, his lips curled into a twisted grin. It was a showy smile, but false, masking the unease brewing underneath. He lifted his chin and scanned the room as if to declare that the slap was proof of his authority, that he was the one who made the rules here in this place called the House of Justice. His smirk trembled slightly, but his eyes betrayed him. They were restless because he could feel the atmosphere shifting, no longer leaning in his favor. Evelyn sat upright, raising a hand to wipe the blood trailing from the corner of her mouth. The red spread across her pale skin, but her gaze stayed bright, cold, and proud. She looked at Bradley slowly without flinching, then spoke in a low, steady voice, each word dropping heavily to the stone floor. "You think silence means submission, but silence can be a verdict." The short sentence rang like a bell of solid brass, shaking the room to its core. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration, one that forced everyone present to face a truth that could no longer be ignored. The crowd fell silent, whispers cut short by the weight of her words. A few people exchanged glances, realizing they had just witnessed something irreversible. A young woman holding a folder, eyes welling up as she heard the sentence, whispered to her friend beside her, "She's not afraid she's putting him on trial with silence." Others nodded, hands trembling as they held their phones, not pointed at the floor like before, but raised now, aimed forward to capture every moment, every movement. The air thickened, as if the courtroom had turned into a stage where the man who thought himself the lead had unknowingly handed the spotlight to the one he tried to humiliate. Bradley tried to stand tall, took a deep breath to reclaim dominance, but his eyes were losing their edge. Every gaze in the room bore down on him, pushing his back against an invisible wall. Meanwhile, Evelyn did very little. She simply sat, her hands resting gently on her lap again, blood still marking the corner of her mouth, but her eyes burned like fire in the dark, as if the entire room now had to reflect her pride. Michael stood behind the wheelchair, his hands clenched tight on the push handles, his heart on the verge of bursting. He looked at his wife, his eyes full of worry and pride. He wanted to charge forward to knock Bradley down, but Evelyn's words had stopped him. He realized this moment didn't belong to his fury. It belonged to the steady strength of the woman who had chosen not fists, but words sharp enough to leave the other man speechless. An old man in the back row, his hair white, his eyes clouded with age, yet suddenly lit by Evelyn's words, nodded slowly and murmured, "Justice doesn't need to shout. Sometimes justice is just a look, just one line like that." The person next to him heard, looked up at Evelyn with quiet respect. The whole courtroom seemed to share that feeling. That respect was spreading, eroding the false pride Bradley clung to. Bradley began to feel suffocated, as if the thick air itself was closing in around him. His eyes darted across the room looking for support, but even the eyes of his colleagues seated behind him had changed. Some turned away, some looked down, and some even stared back at him with doubt. The sense of isolation crept into his mind, and through it all, Evelyn remained still, the streak of bright red against her calm face, embedding her image even deeper into the memory of everyone present. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. Bradley's slap, meant as an act of violence, had turned the entire situation on its head. The woman in the wheelchair had become the center of everything. Her words echoed, her eyes lit up, and her silence became an invisible verdict against the one who had dismissed another's dignity. And the crowd, once mere spectators, had become witnesses. No one could deny what they had just seen. The room was heavy, but within that weight, a wave was forming, a truth too strong to suppress. Evelyn Carter, with a drop of blood and a single sentence, had forced the room to face what they had long avoided. Power, when abused, becomes the very rope that turns on the one who holds it. And Bradley, though still trying to stand firm behind a forced grin, had begun to tremble inside, because he knew that her silence was not surrender. It was the loudest judgment delivered in a room full of people. The courtroom hung heavy with tension, every gaze fixed like a spell on the woman who had just taken Officer Bradley's slap in full. The whispers that had flared up moments before were now gone, replaced by a silence so dense it pressed down like a stone wall ready to crush anyone standing beneath it. Evelyn Carter sat upright, her breath steady, her eyes cold and bright. A drop of blood still ran from the corner of her mouth, deep red against pale fabric, and that single streak only sharpened her face like a mark carved to last. The entire room, from ordinary citizens to young students, lawyers, and officials, was frozen in that moment. No one dared move. They waited to see what would follow. Bradley still stood there, the twisted grin stuck to his face, his eyes shining with smug satisfaction. He thought he had delivered a final blow, forcing her to lower her head in shame. But the next moment shattered that illusion. Evelyn placed both hands on the sides of her wheelchair, her thin fingers tense, every joint visible, then slowly pressed down. The air in the courtroom shifted as if everyone had stopped breathing at once, watching her strain. The wheels creaked faintly as the chair rolled back slightly under the pressure of her arms lifting her body. She didn't rush. Each movement was steady, deliberate, and that very slowness made every eye lock tighter on her, made hundreds of hearts pound faster. Then she stood fully upright, her body straight, her back unshaken, her shoulders strong like a pillar rising from the center of a storm. The fluorescent lights from above cast down on her slight but unyielding frame, making her appear almost separate from everything else in the room. A sharp exhale sounded from the back rows, followed by startled gasps from those nearby. Eyes widened, unable to process how the pale woman who looked too weak to even stand had risen with such steadiness. Breaths turned into a chaotic chorus, the courtroom filled with the stuttering rhythm of countless lungs, and in the middle of it all, Evelyn Carter spoke. Not loud, not shouted, just clearly enough, her voice deep, solid, and echoing. "I am Judge Evelyn Carter." The words exploded in everyone's minds. Those recording tightened their grip, phones shaken in their hands. A few people dropped their folders, papers scattering across the floor, but no one bent to pick them up. Every eye turned to Evelyn, then to Bradley. A truth had just been laid bare. The man who had delivered a cruel public slap hadn't just struck a woman, hadn't just struck a black woman, he had assaulted a sitting judge. The room was consumed by a quiet chaos, a collective shock that tightened every chest before breaking them wide open. Bradley froze like a man whose footing had just been ripped out from under him. He staggered half a step, his face pale as ash, the arrogance drained from his lips, leaving behind a twisted crease at the corner of his mouth. His hand clenched into a fist, joints cracking, but the fist trembled, useless. He looked around, eyes searching for something to hold on to, but all he saw was fear, disgust, and outrage etched into the faces of the crowd. Unease gnawed at him, making the ground beneath him tilt and sway. In that moment, power no longer lived in the golden badge on his chest. It had slipped from his grasp and landed in the sharp blade-like gaze of Evelyn. The woman he had slapped had become the one standing on an invisible bench delivering judgment to the man who thought he could shame her. No one needed to shout. No one needed to protest. Her single sentence and unwavering stance had already shattered the mask of false authority. Evelyn didn't need a gavel in her hand. Her calm defiance and the truth of who she was had already become the first verdict against Bradley, right there in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Michael stood behind the wheelchair, his hand gripping the frame tightly, his eyes red, not from pain, but from the pride welling up inside him. He had always known Evelyn was strong, but never had he seen her turn a packed courtroom into living proof of truth and resolve. He wanted to step forward to say something, but the words stuck in his throat because he knew this moment was not his. It belonged to Evelyn, who had turned blood and pain into an untouchable shield. A few senior lawyers near the front slowly removed their glasses, wiping sweat from their brows, their eyes on Evelyn filled with astonishment and respect. Young students in the back sat wide-eyed, knowing they were witnessing something that would become history, a moment no textbook could replicate, a moment only raw, unfiltered reality could create. They whispered to one another, rushed and breathless, then fell silent again. No one wanted to miss a second, not even a blink. Bradley kept backing away, each step heavy lost like a man with no direction. The slap he thought was the height of power had become proof of his own disgrace. He saw the eyes locked onto him, saw the contempt in the faces of colleagues who once nodded with deference. Every stare hit him like a slap in return, making his cheek burn, not from any hand, but from the judgment of the entire room. Evelyn lifted her chin, wiping the last trace of blood from her lip. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, not avoiding, not lowering. That gaze wasn't just for Bradley. It was for everyone within these four walls, a silent message that justice cannot be struck down by an arrogant hand. Whispers rose again, but this time not in confusion. They came like a tide of rising outrage. Everyone in the room now understood this moment had surpassed a personal incident. It had become an event, a shockwave, and the fire it lit would not be easily put out. The courtroom, built to maintain order, had become the stage for a visible shift in power. Bradley struggled to remain upright, but his trembling posture betrayed the panic creeping through him. Evelyn stood firm, her face calm, but her eyes cut like blades, slicing through the false armor he still clung to. And from that moment on, everyone in the room knew the balance of justice had tilted. Power no longer belonged to the shining badge, it belonged to the eyes of the woman who had just spoken her truth, Judge Evelyn Carter. In a small cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, the scent of freshly roasted coffee lingered in the air, and soft background music played to match the rhythm of half-finished conversations. Everything moved as it would on a typical midday until the blue glow of phone screens lit up every face at once. A group of students just back from the courthouse, and still shaken by what they had witnessed, gathered around an old wooden table. One of their phones buzzed a social media alert. The video of the slap had just been posted to Twitter. In less than an hour, it had reached hundreds of thousands of views. They were stunned. What they had seen with their own eyes was no longer confined to four courtroom walls. It had spread beyond anyone's control. On the screen, the clip played again and again. Officer Bradley suddenly raising his hand, the harsh slap, echoing blood, sliding from the corner of Evelyn Carter's mouth, then her eyes lighting up as she rose and revealed her identity. The courtroom noise had faded behind the voice of the person filming, but the image alone was enough to punch through to millions. Comments flooded in line after searing line. He hit a judge. Did he really slap a judge? Outrageous. Justice for Evelyn. What began as disbelief turned into a collective roar across the internet, launching the video into trending status within seconds. In one corner of the cafe, a young student with curly hair clutched his head, eyes wide as he stared at the words on the screen, his hand trembling. He shouted at his friend, "I can't believe it. He actually did that in court." Others nearby overheard, put down their cups, and turned their eyes to the screen, where Bradley's face loomed cold and proud in the moment he struck. The student's hand shook not from fear, but fury from the shame felt across an entire community as they watched a white officer publicly degrade a black female judge. That emotion spread to the others, sparking a flurry of movement, chairs scraping, voices rising, tension thickening in the air. Within minutes, the video appeared on countless other accounts, each share adding weight. Viewers stared at their screens, hardly blinking for fear of missing a second. Some replayed the moment Bradley's hand hit Evelyn's face. Others paused on the drop of red at her mouth. Others still froze the shot on her burning eyes. Each frame became evidence, became a symbol of exposed abuse of power. The quiet cafe now felt more like an unofficial war room where outrage boiled over. Arguments flared, and everyone agreed this was not just a slap to one woman, but to justice itself. At a table across the room, a middle-aged man took a hard drag from his cigarette and said, "He just slapped the entire country in front of everyone." A young woman sitting across from him nodded firmly, eyes wet with tears, but voice sharp. "This is living proof we can't let it disappear." They didn't know each other, but in that moment, outrage made them allies. Phones went up, the video was shared again. Hashtags rolled rapidly across screens. From a small cafe, a fire spread without limit, breaking past walls, flooding every online platform. In a dorm room at a nearby university, students crowded around a laptop screen, faces tense, eyes locked on every frame. They weren't just watching, they were typing, filling the comment sections with fury. Justice must be served. Don't let justice become a joke. Some broke down in tears, others held hands tightly and chanted aloud in their room as if standing in the middle of a protest. They all knew that the man standing in court that day hadn't just slapped a woman. He had struck at every value justice was supposed to protect. In under 2 hours, the clip had passed 1 million views. Online news outlets pushed breaking updates and television networks aired the footage on loop. Bradley raising his hand, Evelyn rising, and her voice ringing out, "I am Judge Evelyn Carter." Bold red headlines lit up screens across the country. Police officer slaps black judge in open court. A slap that shook the nation's faith in justice. The image became the centerpiece of a national conversation, moving from cafes to conference rooms, from dorms to dinner tables. Back at the cafe, chairs scraped the floor as people stood up, too shaken to sit still. They pointed at the screen, voices raised, eyes red with anger. A young woman clutched her phone, lips trembling, but her voice rang clear. He thought that slap would silence her, but it made the whole world listen. Heads around her nodded in agreement, as if her words had spoken the truth they all carried inside. In the video, Bradley still stood with the same arrogant posture, but outside the frame, reality had shifted. The crowd in the cafe, the people online, none of them saw him as an officer upholding the law anymore. He was now a man who had betrayed it. Shock spread as people realized that today inside a courtroom, a white police officer had slapped a black judge, and worse, he had done it with a look of satisfaction. In the blue light of millions of phone screens, that image burned bright, an indelible stain that could not be erased. From small cafes, from cramped dorm rooms, from warm living rooms, a wave of outrage began to rise. It was no longer the private story of a single city. It had become a shockwave that reached into the hearts of everyone. Bradley's slap had landed not only on Evelyn, it struck trust. It struck the dignity of the law itself. And Evelyn, with eyes that burned bright and a single steady sentence, turned a moment of humiliation into a flame that lit up millions of screens, making the truth something no one could deny. Night fell and the city sky turned a deep black, but the central square blazed with the light of thousands of candles. The warm golden glow flickered in the night breeze, merging with the hum of voices, footsteps, and rising chants. From every direction, people gathered, their raised signs glowing in candlelight, the words, "No justice, no peace," trembling in the dark but lighting the way for everyone. No one needed orders, no one needed reminders. They came because of a shared outrage, a shared wound now exposed for the world to see. On the cold stone ground of the square, candles stood side by side, their light like fallen stars, illuminating the tense faces and burning eyes of those present. A white man in a heavy coat stepped forward, his hand trembling but firm as he reached for the hand of a black friend beside him. They looked at each other, nodded, then shouted together, "Justice for Evelyn." The chant cracked like thunder, bursting into the air, catching everyone in its current, flowing from the front rows all the way to the back. In an instant, the entire square roared the voices of hundreds, then thousands, rising into one massive wave. They were no longer individuals. They were one body, one heartbeat, chanting Evelyn Carter's name as a symbol of truth trampled and now reclaimed. Michael Carter stood in the middle of that sea of people, his eyes glistening in the glow of 1,000 flames. He had just returned from the courthouse, anger still burning in his chest, but now that anger became strength. A makeshift wooden platform had been set up in the square and the crowd urged him forward. Michael stepped up slowly, his feet moving in rhythm with the pounding hearts around him. As he reached the platform, the night wind swept his hair back and the chants below quieted slightly, making room for his voice. He clenched his fist, raised it high, and spoke in a low, hoarse voice that carried far, "Justice cannot be slapped down." The moment the words left his mouth, the square erupted. Thousands of voices roared roared, cheers, claps, stomping feet pounding into the ground, creating a thunderous sound that rolled like a hammer strike toward the police station just a few blocks away. The concrete walls of the building seemed to shake under the weight of the sound lights inside, blazing brighter than ever, shadows gathering behind the glass eyes peering out. They no longer saw a small protest. They saw an awakened city, a community crying out to reclaim its dignity. Candlelight reflected in Michael's eyes, his face lit with resolve. He looked down at the sea of people below, where faces young and old of every skin color were shouting his wife's name together. Justice for Evelyn rang out over and over like a pounding drumbeat, echoing off the pavement, the steps, the rooftops around the square. A small child on his father's shoulders held up a hand-drawn sign. The shaky letters bold, "Stop the hate." The father looked up, tears falling from his eyes, but his voice joined the crowd in full. Candles kept passing from hand to hand, their light spreading like flames sparked by lightning. Journalists pushed in cameras, sweeping the square, capturing the rare moment when a city became a single living body, its heart pounding with rage. The chants rolled on, merging into each other, turning the square into an unstoppable storm of sound. An elderly woman with silver hair stood at the front, leaning on her cane, holding up a candle, her voice trembling but firm. "Justice for all of us." The crowd answered with a roar, like a tidal wave washing away every trace of fear. Michael took a deep breath, listening to the noise, feeling a fire ignite in his chest. He knew that his wife Evelyn was no longer inside a closed courtroom. She was here in every candle, in every shout, in every raised hand. She had become a symbol, and these people were living proof that the symbol had taken root. He bowed his head, placed his hand over his heart, then raised a clenched fist high and shouted again, "Justice does not bow to tyranny." And this time the square didn't just erupt, it shattered under the scream of a people who would no longer stay silent. The nearby police station was sealed shut, but inside the officers on duty heard every word echoing through the halls. Some exchanged looks, eyes uncertain, because they knew what Bradley had done could not be defended. Meanwhile, out in the square, drums, pots, and whistles rang out in chaos, blending with the chants into a furious rhythm shared by the entire city. People banged on anything that could make noise, tin cans, street signs, even lamp posts, to send the sound further, to drive it deeper. The fire of that night could not be put out. The image of a square lit with candles, thousands shouting in unison, became a haunting scene, etched into the memory of everyone present, and quickly captured in a video already spreading online before the night was over. Across platforms, hundreds of live streams went up, each account, another link in the storm carrying the sound of the square into the living rooms of millions. Hashtags appeared non-stop, the phrase "Justice for Evelyn" glowing on every blue screen, rolling endlessly, turning into a tidal wave that erased every attempt to bury the truth. As the clock on the city hall struck the late hour, the chanting had not stopped. Michael stood on the platform, his voice now hoarse, but his eyes still burned. He knew that tomorrow and the days after the fight would go on. But tonight, the square had awakened, and this city had changed forever. Tonight, justice had been called by the roar of thousands, and its echo had slammed into the cold walls of a system long used to standing apart from the people's pain. The newsroom of a major television channel was consumed by chaos. The phones rang non-stop, keyboards clacked in a frenzy, and the wall of monitors blinked with a constant stream of breaking updates. On the main screens, the video of Officer Bradley slapping Evelyn Carter played on repeat, slowed frame by frame, each swing of his hand sending a chill through the room. Viewers didn't need sound. Just watching that moment, the drop of blood, the blaze in Evelyn's eyes was enough to make their hearts ache. The image stuck, replaying endlessly, holding the editors in place. They knew they were sitting on a story that could shake the nation. On other news networks, special reports went live that very night. Clips were trimmed, stitched into sequences and broadcast side by side with images of the candlelit square. Anchors delivered lines fast and tight, moving viewers from the courtroom's silence to the fury of the crowd outside. Panels of commentators sat in rows, their faces tense, uncertain, all searching for how to explain an act that defied defense. One of them, a white man with graying hair, tried to remain composed. His voice came slow and measured. "Perhaps it was a moment of overreaction during official duty. We should wait for the investigation before passing judgment." But even as he spoke, the screen beside him lit up with an endless scroll of social media posts, drowning his words with a flood of anger and rejection. Across digital platforms, hashtags exploded at a speed never seen before. Phrases like "justice for Evelyn," "he hit a judge," and "justice cannot be slapped down" rolled nonstop, dominating every trending chart. No one paid attention to half-hearted defenses anymore. The wave of public outrage was too powerful, overwhelming every attempt to soften what Bradley had done. Users didn't just share the clip. They trimmed it, edited it, added subtitles, and added music, transforming the moment into a viral symbol. Some versions focused only on Evelyn's eyes after the slap. Others looped the second she rose and said, "I am Judge Evelyn Carter." Each version was shared hundreds of thousands of times, like fragments of a single bomb detonating everywhere at once. During a primetime live stream, a young host with a serious face declared boldly on air, "It's not because the victim is a judge that the public is outraged. It's because he believed the law belonged to him alone. That is the real crime." The statement cut through the air like a blade, leaving viewers across the nation stunned. This was no longer the cautious tone typical of media. It touched a shared wound, turning the broadcast into a space where the public felt truly heard. Inside the newsroom, the host's colleagues sat frozen, then erupted in quiet agreement, understanding that he had said aloud what millions had been thinking, but no one had dared to voice on live television. The momentum didn't stop at the national border. International networks began covering the story, asking, "Can justice remain fair when a judge is assaulted inside her own courtroom?" Footage of the awakened square aired alongside the slap, forming a stark contrast, one frame of brute force, the other of unified resistance. Foreign correspondents called it a slap that echoed through the image of America, comparing the incident to past flashpoints that had once set the country ablaze. In newsrooms across the country, editors worked through the night. Bold headlines took over front pages. "Police officer slaps black judge, shock to the nation's faith in justice." "One slap, a country shaken." Commentaries poured in from scholars, politicians, and ordinary citizens, all swept up in the current of the event. Digital outlets reported record traffic readership, multiplying by the minute, as everyone searched for more facts, more proof, more images to match the story they'd just heard. In a crowded bar, a TV on the wall played the news channel, and all conversation stopped as Bradley's face appeared. The audio slowed, his hand swung down. Evelyn's face appeared, the blood, the eyes blazing. The bar fell silent. Someone set their beer down. Someone else clenched their jaw. Then the chant erupted, "Justice for Evelyn." The words weren't just for the square anymore, or the feeds online. They had made their way into everyday corners of life. The original clip quickly surpassed 1 million views, the number climbing by the minute. News networks had no choice but to follow. Government officials were forced to respond. A spokesperson stepped up and issued a brief statement, "We are aware of the situation. An investigation will be conducted transparently." But the cold tone did little to ease the fury spreading like wildfire. The public wanted more. They demanded action. They demanded to see justice restored. The newsroom lights were still on past midnight. Editors, reporters, and anchors all knew they weren't just reporting the news, they were bearing witness to an upheaval. They adjusted footage, added subtitles, and emphasized every word, making sure no viewer could look away. Under the flickering glow of flashing monitors, one truth became clearer than ever. The media was no longer an outside observer, but a bridge for the public's outrage, turning Bradley's slap into a viral explosion that shattered every wall of silence. Inside the mayor's spacious office, yellow light spilled over a heavy wooden desk stacked with papers, and every sound echoed with grating clarity. Phones rang non-stop, one after another, sending aides rushing in and out, faces pale. Outside the large window, the mayor's reflection loomed, anxiety carved deep into his features, eyes bloodshot from hours of watching the news unfold. The latest media reports poured in. The slap video had become the epicenter, spreading faster than anyone could contain, and now the pressure no longer came from a small group of citizens, but from the entire political system. Human rights organizations spoke out in unison, their tone sharper than ever. They issued statements, appeared on live broadcasts, declaring that without clear action, they would launch nationwide protests. The language in those press releases was no longer advisory, but a direct warning. Some groups had already published protest schedules for the coming weekend, pledging to fill public squares with tens of thousands. That pressure felt like a noose tightening around the city's leadership, making every decision exponentially heavier. In the emergency meeting room, the tension was so thick that even breathing sounded compressed. A prominent senator, stern-faced, tapped his firm hand on the table rhythmically, the dry knocks cutting through the silence. He stood, eyes burning with anger, voice ringing out. This is no longer an assault on a civilian. This is an insult to the court. Each word landed like a needle, piercing the hush that gripped the room. Some senators lowered their heads, others nodded, but all understood his point, struck the heart of the matter. This was no longer about one rogue officer. It had become a national stain, shaking the already fragile trust in justice. Outside, the media added fuel to the fire. Breaking news segments kept airing, showing footage of candlelit crowds beside Bradley's tense face, alongside nervous statements from lawmakers. That contrast only deepened public outrage and escalated demands for bold action. Inside the administration, advisors clashed over possible responses, some pushing to suspend Bradley to ease tensions, others warning it would divide the police force. The mayor sat at the center of the storm, hands clenched white, knowing every path led to crisis, but that silence meant political suicide. The phone rang again, this time from the governor's office. An aide leaned in to whisper, draining the remaining color from the mayor's face. The governor's voice on the other end was firm, demanding a response within 24 hours, or the state government would intervene. The message was nothing short of an ultimatum, forcing the mayor to act immediately. The room sank into a heavy silence, everyone understanding that the situation had outgrown the bounds of a single city and had become a much larger political equation, where any misstep could trigger an unprecedented storm. In the dim light spilling through the window, the mayor's face looked more gaunt, his eyes heavy, but there was no escape. Outside, tens of thousands were chanting Evelyn's name, while inside every word of the senator's rebukes still echoed. Power no longer rested solely in his hands. It was being pulled from all directions, from the streets to the legislature, and he knew that with every second of silence, the city edged closer to chaos that could no longer be contained. International media quickly jumped in. Major newspapers across Europe and Asia simultaneously published the video, with headlines all focusing on one detail: the image of America, long claiming to be a symbol of justice, now showing a white police officer slapping a black female judge in open court. Global news channels pressed questions. Washington correspondents scrambled to comment, some calling it a slap to the nation's dignity, others comparing it to America's darkest public reckonings. On television screens, the image of Evelyn Carter standing tall, blood still on her face, was shown beside the American flag flapping in the wind, a contrast so stark it haunted viewers across the globe. Scathing opinion pieces followed in international journals, not condemning one man, but an entire system that allowed such abuse to happen in a place meant to uphold fairness. That pressure rebounded back home, where security leadership was more unsettled than ever. In the police chief's office, cold white light from the TV screen cast sharp shadows across his tense face. The landline rang, non-stop calls pouring in from superiors, journalists, civil rights groups, all asking the same thing: how would the police department respond? The chief sat motionless, hands hands clasped fingertips trembling slightly. One side came from within dozens of officers still loyal to Bradley, calling his action a personal mistake and insisting the department must stand by its own. They feared that abandoning Bradley would collapse internal trust and tear the force apart beyond repair. But on the other side was the pressure from public opinion, from both domestic and international media, rising fast and loud. If the department continued to shield him, the entire agency would be dragged into the storm of outrage, and its already fragile reputation would be crushed completely. The public image of the police, already cracked, was now being torn wider, and one wrong move could turn everything into a full-blown crisis. The police chief leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily, knowing he was trapped between two opposing waves, one of loyalty, the other of responsibility to salvage the department's integrity, both too heavy to choose between easily. In the silent room, only the relentless ringing of the phone remained a reminder that delay was not an option, and the chief knew any hesitation could become the final cut that severs the public's trust in the force he leads. The Department of Justice headquarters in Washington lit up against the night, white lights spilling onto the pavement like a signal that a reckoning could no longer be avoided. Convoys of news vans lined up outside the gates, lenses pointed directly at the makeshift podium where Michael Carter had just stepped forward, his posture resolute. His face showed the toll of sleepless nights, but his eyes held the sharp light of determination. Camera shutters clicked non-stop, reporters shouted his name across the wide courtyard, but Michael did not waver. He placed both hands on the wooden podium, looked straight into the dozens of lenses aimed at him, and spoke in a low, firm voice. "We don't want pity. We want justice." The words were short but heavy, like a declaration echoing beyond the courtyard and into millions of live streams. It was no longer a plea but a demand, a call for justice to be restored to its rightful place. Immediately after the speech, national networks aired emergency segments flashing Michael's words in bold letters across their screen. The moment sparked a new wave of outrage as the public heard the clarity in every syllable, saw pain turned into strength, and realized the system's silence could no longer be stretched. At the same time, across social media, the hashtag #HeHitTheJudge spread like wildfire, taking over every platform. Millions of posts flooded in edited clips, images of the candlelit square, personal messages of anger. The online space became a sea of words and images, a collective voice merging into one message: no one is allowed to use power to disgrace justice. That wave no longer stopped at national borders, quickly surfacing on the front pages of major newspapers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Scholars and international political commentators published analyses questioning the ideals America had long claimed to uphold. News programs in London, Paris, and Tokyo aired the footage of Bradley slapping Evelyn, followed by Michael's speech. Anchors did not mask the gravity of the moment, emphasizing that the actions of one local police officer had shaken global faith. At this point, the federal government could no longer remain on the sidelines. Inside the Department of Justice, senior officials held meetings through the night. Internal phones rang off the hook, reports poured in from multiple agencies, and pressure from the public and international community left no room for hesitation. A decision was made, and a press release issued before dawn confirmed that the federal government was officially launching a special investigation into the case and deploying federal agents to the city where the incident occurred. The news spread instantly across all major media outlets, prompting millions to cheer, viewing it as the first concrete step proving that justice had not been entirely forgotten. Under the harsh lights of the Washington building, crowds gathered outside still refused to leave, chanting the very words Michael had just spoken, turning them into slogans. And from that moment on, the entire nation understood that this was no longer a personal incident, but a defining test for the justice system and the people's trust in it. The Department of Justice's press release aired on national television in the middle of the night, and the country held its breath. A spokesperson stood at the podium, voice clear and firm, each word landing like a warning aimed at the entire system. "We are officially launching a federal investigation and will deploy agents on site to ensure complete transparency." The statement, brief but weighty, rang like a signal flare before an incoming storm. In that moment, viewers across the country erupted applause. Cheers from public squares, cramped apartments, and student dorms thundered through the night as everyone recognized that justice was beginning to shift from demand into tangible action. On social media, the news spread at lightning speed, every line fueling the momentum of public pressure, like oxygen feeding a reignited flame. In the city where the incident had occurred, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. From police headquarters to cafes, from council chambers to street corners, everyone was talking about the imminent arrival of federal agents. They weren't coming to observe. They were coming to dig deep into the most sensitive corners, to flip through every file, to scrutinize every word of testimony. Local officials understood that control had slipped from their hands. Now every move and every decision would fall under the microscope of Washington. Lower-ranking officers grew quieter, their eyes more guarded, and no one dared defend Bradley as they once had, because everyone knew that once the federal agent stepped in, no personal connections would be enough to offer protection. In a narrow room, the dim yellow light cast down on Officer Bradley's face. The phone in his hand buzzed non-stop, notifications piling up, but it took only one message from his superiors to leave him frozen. Federal agents would arrive within 24 hours. Bradley gripped the phone tightly, the veins in his hand bulging, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed on the black screen. Every trace of arrogance vanished, replaced by a pallor, as if the blood had drained from his body. A dull ringing filled his ears, the chaotic chants of the crowd outside crashing into his mind. He knew the net had closed and every exit blocked no way out. Bradley's breathing grew heavy, and though he leaned against the wall, his body trembled in waves. The images flooded in his slap, once believed to be a decisive show of force. Evelyn Carter's blazing eyes, the crowd shouting her name in the square, and now the looming presence of the federal government. Each memory struck like a blade, twisting deeper into his already fraying sense of control, leaving behind gashes that would never heal. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in the ceiling, dropping lower, as if the space itself was closing around him. The phone still lit in his hand, its screen flashing with cold words from the Department of Justice, a verdict not yet spoken, but already clear. And in that moment, Bradley understood there was nothing left to cling to. No authority left to hide behind, only the truth knocking at his door, carrying the firm hand of federal agents. Inside the closed-door meeting room of the police department, dim yellow lights hanging from the ceiling cast a heavy glow on tense faces, the air so thick that even sighs echoed clearly. On the long table, cluttered with paperwork, old case files were stacked high, many pages yellowed with age. A senior officer leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically on the table, then suddenly released a low whisper, his voice dropping as if conceding a truth. "We can't cover this up anymore." The words sent a jolt through the room. A few glances exchanged, part shock, part relief, because everyone knew it was time for that truth to be spoken. On the large screen at the back of the room, breaking news footage continued to roll, the image of Bradley slapping Evelyn Carter playing on loop like a thorn stabbing at everyone's eyes. Each time the clip replayed, the silence in the room deepened, not just because it showed abuse of power, but because it stood as an indictment of the entire system that had nurtured that distorted authority. Another officer slid a thick folder to the center of the table. Inside it was a list of complaints filed against Bradley over the years. Loose papers, signatures, official stamps, all surfaced like long-forgotten ghosts, now returning to demand justice. A younger officer, a recently promoted lieutenant, picked up one of the files, flipped through a few pages, then clenched his fist. Inside was a report on a violent arrest that once stirred controversy, but was quickly buried by the very superiors sitting in this room. He looked up, voice tight but steady. "If we had handled this properly back then, none of this would be happening today." No one responded, but many lowered their heads, eyes fixed on the table as if trying to avoid avoid the truth staring back at them. A whiteboard was pulled into view, covered with small notes listing names of victims, dates, and locations. Each scrap of paper marked a wound that had never healed but had been deliberately ignored. Now, under the spotlight of Washington, everything was exposed. Senior officers sat in silence, some rubbing their foreheads, others biting their lips, knowing full well that what had once been hidden could no longer be buried. The public outcry was too loud. The federal government was involved, and if they continued to shield the truth, the entire structure would collapse under its weight. In one corner, the chief of police quietly observed every glance, noticing how once solid loyalty was beginning to crack. The nods of agreement that once came easily had turned into wary stares as each officer silently questioned whether staying silent was still worth it. That undercurrent of doubt spread quickly like a thick sheet of ice beginning to fracture, waiting for one hard strike to shatter it completely. And in the rustle of reopened case files, everyone understood the fracture would never heal without a full purge, without placing the truth squarely on the table for judgment. A suffocating silence hung over the room, stretching unbearably, until suddenly a young officer stood up. His face bore the marks of inner conflict. His voice trembled, but rang out firmly, shattering the long-standing wall of silence. "If we stay quiet tomorrow, it could be our family." The words fell heavy like a stone thrown into a still lake, making every eye in the room snap upward, no one daring to pretend this was just an isolated incident. Some older officers inhaled sharply, hands resting on the files in front of them. Others gripped their chair arms, eyes wavering. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. It was no longer about a woman being slapped in court, but a warning that anyone could become a victim if abuse of power continued to be enabled. Cole sat not far away, his hand resting on his knee, fingers clenched so tightly the veins rose beneath his skin. He tried to keep a neutral expression, but the confusion was clear in his eyes. He had long grown used to unwavering protection from his peers, to looks of respect, even fear, whenever he walked into a room. But now, the thick air in the room made it hard to breathe, as if every current had turned against him. The young officer's words echoed in his head, each syllable a blade piercing the arrogant shell he clung to. The room, once a space for strategy, had transformed into a silent courtroom. No one said it aloud, but the way they looked Cole had changed. Some stared directly, their eyes cold, demanding answers. Others turned to colleagues, exchanging discreet nods. The atmosphere was so dense that every breath felt like proof the wall of protection had begun to crack. Cole felt a chill down his spine, his shoulders heavy, realizing isolation was taking root right where he once believed he was safest. For the first time in his career, Cole couldn't hear support behind him. Instead, he felt every fracture in the brotherhood he had relied on for so long. The rustle of paper, the sighs, the sidelong glances, all formed a closing soundtrack reminding him that the seat of power beneath him was no longer steady. He glanced around, searching for a familiar nod of reassurance, but found none, only silence and eyes that wouldn't meet his. Cole shut his eyes for a moment, sweat beading on his forehead, then opened them again, his gaze unmoored. Within those pale yellow walls, he was no longer the feared officer, but a name surrounded by quiet resistance. The young officer's words had sparked something, a shift from fear to awakening, from silence to discontent. And Cole, who once believed himself the center of the force, now felt the cold isolation closing in inch by inch until there was nowhere left to hide. In a small technical room deep in the courthouse basement, the glow of dozens of screens lit up the pale face of the shift technician. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the cooling fan and the soft tapping of keys. As the security footage was rewound for review, a single frame suddenly made the man at the monitor freeze. He leaned in, eyes locked on the silent clip, the image so clear it sent a chill down his spine. Just before Cole's hand struck Evelyn Carter's face, his lips lips moved, forming words soaked in venom. The technician couldn't hear the audio, but reading his lips was enough. They were slurs laced with hate. He sat up straight, sweat beading on his forehead, fingers trembling as he replayed the clip over and over. With each loop, Cole's lip movements became more distinct, and each repetition made the technician's chest tighten. It wasn't just a slap anymore. He now held proof of motive, the kind that stripped away any possible excuse. He glanced around the room briefly, afraid someone else might be watching, then quickly opened a separate hard drive, saving the clip. His hands still shook, but his eyes now burned with resolve, as if he had just given himself the duty of a silent witness. The air in the room seemed heavier after that decision. He sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the clip playing in an endless loop. Cole's furious expression, the fire in his eyes, and the shape of words that would haunt anyone who saw them. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension surge through his body, then stood abruptly and scribbled a quick note into the technical log. Inside him, fear battled with a longing for safety, because he knew that once this footage came to light, it would become a blade pointed straight at the entire system. Outside the room, the courthouse hallway buzzed with footsteps and conversation echoing off the tiled floor, but inside the tech room, the world felt still. The technician knew he now held not just a video clip, but a key to exposing the truth. That footage could strip Cole of every shield he had, could implicate those who had protected him, and could also put the technician himself at risk. But when he remembered Evelyn's face, lifted proudly, despite the blood at the corner of her mouth, her eyes still burning bright, he knew there was no other choice he could live with. He shut down the main screen, removed the hard drive, and carefully slipped it into his coat pocket. That gesture was a silent vow the truth would not be buried in the dark. As he stepped out of the room, his legs trembled, but his stride remained steady. The hallway stretched long and dim, the soft lights casting his shadow across the floor like the image of a man bearing a weight too great, yet still moving forward. In that moment, he understood that what he was doing wasn't just to protect one person, but to protect the true meaning of justice, the very thing that had been stained by the hands of the abusive. In the darkness blanketing the city, a piece of truth had been preserved, waiting to be revealed. And from that tiny technical room, the flame of justice had quietly been lit, promising to erupt when placed before the light of the world. No one had asked him to do it, but as he watched the video, the technician knew some truths didn't need sound to be heard. A single frame, a single slap, a single distorted movement of Cole's lips told the entire story. The hateful words didn't have to be heard. His every movement made them real. Carefully, he adjusted the brightness, zoomed in, then quietly saved a backup copy, a way to ensure this truth could never vanish. There was a faint fear within him, but it quickly gave way to quiet pride because he knew he had just secured a critical piece of justice. In the brightly lit courtroom, the air was thick. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the prosecution bench. A moment of silence hung as the prosecutor stood, his voice low and firm as he requested, "With the court's permission, we ask to present surveillance footage." The words echoed like a bell, shattering the tension, shaking the room. Everyone understood this would be the moment of truth where undeniable evidence would appear before them all. The large screen on the wall lit up its bright glare, pulling every gaze toward it. The video played silent images rolling in slow motion, each frame sharp like a cold blade. Viewers held their breath, eyes wide, watching Cole approach, face twisted, hand strike, and before it, his lips moved with unmistakable malice. No sound was needed. The truth was read on his face. Horror swept the room. Whispers broke out. Fists, clenched hands, covered mouths, and Cole sat frozen, the color draining from his face with every second. The light from the screen shone directly onto his face, revealing every twitch, every pale streak. Cole tried to sit upright, but sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes darted wildly, and his hand trembled slightly beneath the table. He knew everyone was watching, knew this evidence could not be denied. For the first time, the mask of power he had long worn was torn off in front of hundreds of witnesses. No explanation was needed. No defense required. The image had already spoken for him. The prosecutor stood tall, eyes fixed on Cole, his voice ringing clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is indisputable evidence. This was not a slap in chaos, but a deliberate act with a clear discriminatory motive." A fist hit the table in agreement, the crowd stirred, and people began shouting in outrage. Every eye turned to Cole again, not with curiosity, but with direct condemnation. In the white glare of the screen, Cole's face turned ashen, his lips pressed tightly, but the silence now concealed nothing. Even without another word from him, the video had spoken loud enough, had become the voice of millions, turning the truth into a cold mirror reflecting the true face of the abuser. And in the packed courtroom, everyone knew that from this moment on, Cole had no way out. No legal argument could wipe away what had been shown, no uniform could shield him. Every frame had etched itself into memory, his expression, his motion, his intent. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing a trial anymore, it was watching the unraveling of impunity. Cole's posture sagged further, as if the weight of the truth had finally landed. Outside the courthouse, the chants were already rising again. Inside, the silence returned not from uncertainty, but from realization. No one spoke yet, all had reached the same conclusion. The truth once hidden had found its way to light, and with it came the reckoning. The police station's break room, once filled with laughter stories, and the clatter of mugs had fallen into a heavy, uneasy silence. The TV on the wall replayed the breaking news showing the moment Cole raised his hand. Evelyn standing tall with a bright red streak at the corner of her mouth and eyes burning with defiance. The anchor's voice was even, but each word hit like a nail, driven deeper into the already cracked wall inside those watching. Officers were scattered around the room, some seated, others by the window, yet none spoke. No greetings, no familiar nods in Cole's direction. The respect once afforded to him had vanished, replaced by cold distance, leaving him alone in the corner. Cole slumped on the bench, back hunched, eyes fixed on the screen, but mind blank. He had grown used to looks of deference, to friendly slaps on the back, but now an invisible wall stood between him and everyone else. No one scolded him. No one accused him, but the silence itself was the harshest judgment. He reached for the water bottle on the table, squeezing it tightly, veins rising on his hand, but there was no gesture strong enough to erase the truth now displayed on the screen. In the corner of the room, a senior officer sat in deep thought, his eyes never leaving the TV. After a few minutes, he rose slowly, removed his badge, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the table. The soft clink of metal on wood echoed sharply, sending a shock through the room. It wasn't just a personal gesture, but a quiet declaration he no longer wanted to be tied to the darkness now hanging over the department. A few other officers looked on silent, but in their eyes was agreement and a shared belief that this act was a form of protest. Cole turned, seeing the badge gleaming on the table, and his chest burned. He understood this was separation, a refusal without words. He wanted to scoff, to roar, and prove he still had a place here, but his throat closed up, all his strength suddenly drained. The TV kept playing, reporting that federal agents were now involved, showing crowds holding candles, chanting Evelyn's name like a public verdict echoing through the break room. The air was thick, the silence unbroken, leaving Cole alone in his raw isolation. Every averted gaze, every heavy breath, carved deeper into the unease tightening inside him. He could feel the walls around him collapse, no hand left to reach for. And for the first time in years, the man who had once used power to trample others was forced to confront a harsh truth. He had no one left, no comrades, only the cold loneliness of being exiled in the very place he had once called his fortress. Bradley sat motionless on the worn-out chair, his hand clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white-green veins bulging sharply along his tense arm. He could hear his own breathing, fast and uneven in the empty room, mixing with the faint clicking from the TV TV, playing a news report. No one was watching anymore. His eyes darted around, searching for a glance, a sign of sympathy, but all he found was a cold void. The faces that once patrolled with him, drank with him, cheered when he walked into a room, now looked down in silence as if his presence had never been part of their brotherhood. No one wanted to meet his eyes because they knew those eyes no longer symbolized strength, but showed a man collapsing under the weight of his own guilt. In Bradley's memory, the sounds of the past still echoed those times he stood in the hallway shouting, "I am the law," drawing nods of agreement, even laughter from the young officers around him. Those had been moments when he felt absolute power, when just a look or a tap on his badge could silence others. But now, in the very place he once believed he ruled, he sat abandoned like a ghost no one saw. The scrape of a chair as another officer stood and left made him flinch, heart tightening because each small movement reminded him the wall around him had fallen. No one wanted to stand by his side anymore. The emptiness of the break room suffocated Bradley. Though the walls remained the same, the ceiling unchanged, the air was different. Everyone who passed stayed quiet. No one needed to condemn him. The silence was enough to turn him into a stranger. In his mind, the image of Evelyn Carter played over and over, her eyes shining even with blood at her lip. A gaze that refused to yield, and it made him shiver. He gripped tighter, the veins on his hand pulsing, as if ready to tear through skin. But that tension offered no strength, only exposed the desperation he couldn't admit. What Bradley once saw as a fortress had become an invisible prison. This place, once a refuge, now felt unfamiliar. He felt cornered, voiceless, joyless, everything retreating into an echo of silence. Every footstep down the hallway outside pounded like a gavel in his mind. Every door creaking open and slamming shut sounded like a verdict closing in. Bradley inhaled, trying to swallow the lump in his throat, but the more he tried, the more the bitterness rose like a confession stuck halfway silenced by his own denial. As the TV screen continued showing images of the candlelit crowd, the chants of justice for Evelyn ringing out, he suddenly realized he had been cast out of both worlds. Outside, the public was furious, chanting the name of the woman he once thought would be humiliated, now turned into an unbreakable symbol. Inside, his fellow officers turned their backs, refusing eye contact, even refusing to acknowledge his presence. The chair he sat in became the only place left to him, cold, isolated. For the first time in years, he fully grasped the emptiness behind the phrase, "I am the law." The law was no longer in the hands of someone like him, and the weight of solitude made Bradley understand the power game was over. In the small room, the dim yellow light cast across his face, revealing every wrinkle, every fractured line. The hands that once reached out to clap him on the back now stayed fixed on files in front of them, as if his existence no longer mattered. Cole Bradley, the man who once shouted that he alone defined the rules, was now abandoned in the very house he believed to be his stage. No more audience, no more comrades, no more applause. Only four walls and a chilling silence that reflected the harsh truth. The man who relied on power was in the end left with no one but himself. The courtroom that day was packed. Every wooden bench stretching to the back of the room was filled, and even the aisles were crowded with tense faces. The air was thick. Whispers slowly faded to silence as Judge Brown entered his posture, commanding, his face marked with the lines of time, but his eyes heavy with restrained anger. The wooden gavel sat before him, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glow that filled the chamber with anxious anticipation. Everyone knew this hearing was unlike any other, because what had come before had turned it into a trial, held not just by the court, but by society itself. The prosecutor rose, his voice firm but unhurried. He scanned the room, then turned toward the bench, each word falling like a weight onto the tile floor. "We call Judge Evelyn Carter to the stand." The name hit the room like a shockwave. People flinched. Some fell still for a moment, eyes wide in disbelief. They knew of the assault, had watched the video repeatedly, but now with the prosecutor officially stating her name, The room was stunned. In that instant, the veil lifted, and everyone present had to confront one truth. The woman who had been slapped was not just anyone, but a judge within the very legal system. A wave of murmurs swept through the rows, a few gasps echoing in the chamber. Faces paled, glances grew unfocused, as if people were only now realizing the slap had not just been a personal attack, but a humiliation aimed at the court itself. A law student in the middle row clutched his head, whispering to the friend beside him, "This has no precedent. We're watching history turn." Meanwhile, in the press section, reporters raised their cameras, firing non-stop flashes, capturing every reaction, every stunned expression across the crowd. Bradley sat at the defendant's table, body hunched slightly, hands clenched tight, his face gray as if drained of blood. He had prepared his excuses, but the official mention of Evelyn Carter's name wiped all defenses away. He stared downward, but the light from dozens of camera lenses left him no place to hide. Every gaze in the courtroom now felt like a blade, and he knew the seat he occupied was no longer the place of someone who upholds the law, but the place of someone now being judged. Judge Brown scanned the courtroom lightly, tapped the gavel against the bench to silence the murmurs. The sharp sound cut through the air, bringing everyone back to the gravity of the hearing. In his deep gaze, the weight came not only from his role as the presiding judge, but also from a personal pain, because he knew the slap had not only left a wound on Evelyn, but a stain on the entire justice system. He sat upright, hands clasped, his eyes fixed on Bradley, a look that alone made the entire courtroom feel the restrained fury burning inside the aging judge. The room was dead silent, the tension so heavy that a falling pen echoed like thunder. And in that silence, everyone understood they were witnessing a historical turning point where justice was no longer an abstract idea, but a living force embodied in the woman who had once been humiliated, now taking the stand as Judge Evelyn Carter. This was no longer just Bradley's trial, it was the trial of an entire system where every eye waited for the truth to be named. The large screen at the front of the room lit up, displaying a close-up of Evelyn Carter's face in that historic moment. The image needed no embellishment or effects. The truth alone was enough to hold every breath still. Blood lined her lips, the mark still fresh, yet it didn't overshadow her presence. In the spotlight, her eyes shone with clarity and pride, as if the entire room reflected the fire of her will. Some eyes blurred with emotion, because this image was no longer just evidence of a slap. It had become a symbol of resilience, of justice rising from pain. Each breath grew heavier, every gaze locked onto the screen, afraid that blinking might mean missing a piece of the truth. Bradley sat there, the light from the screen casting directly onto his face, revealing tremors he couldn't suppress. Every line on his face mirrored his shock. His lips pressed tightly together, his eyes bloodshot and filled with panic. He felt as if Evelyn's gaze from the screen was piercing straight through him, stripping away the layers he had built to wear the mask of authority. The silence in the courtroom was no longer empty space, but a sentence descending upon him second by second. Judge Brown sat tall on the bench, one hand resting on the gavel. As the screen slowly dimmed, he struck the bench hard, the sound sharp and final, reverberating through the room. His eyes locked on Bradley, and in that gaze was a storm unspoken. Behind it lay the restrained outrage, the anguish of a man who had devoted his life to justice and now watched it be publicly defiled. His eyes never left Bradley, as if to say that in this court no one escapes accountability, not even those who wear a badge or shine with official emblems. The air thickened, and everyone in the courtroom fell silent, each person feeling the weight pressing from both sides, Evelyn's fierce defiant gaze and Judge Brown's stormy stare. These two images merged into an unbreakable wall, forcing Bradley to sit there dwarfed by their presence. The sound of the gavel had not simply restored order. It was a declaration that this was no ordinary trial, but a place where justice rose, where the abuser of power must face the naked truth. Under the stark white lighting that flooded the room, the contrast became sharper. Evelyn proud, even with blood still on her lips, Judge Brown, solemn with fire burning behind his eyes, and Bradley trembling between those two forces. Together, They formed a courtroom tableau unlike any other, where silence became a weapon, where looks and images alone were enough to pass judgment without a single word of defense. And in that moment, everyone understood the wheels of justice had begun to turn, and no one could stop them. The air in the courtroom was thick, like a massive block of stone, pressing down on the chest of everyone present. The jurors sat in straight rows, faces tense, eyes fixed on the case files before them. The soft rustling of paper faded, giving way to a silence so deep one could hear the ticking of the clock on the back wall. The prosecutor stood, adjusted the file in his hand, then slowly stepped into the center of the room. He took a deep breath, eyes locked on the jury, voice loud and firm. "This is not just a slap, it is a mockery of justice." That conclusion hit like a hammer in the already strained air. Spectators looked up at once, eyes blazing with outrage. Every word the prosecutor said echoed in their minds, etched in memory, as proof that this act was no sudden impulse, but a blatant challenge to the entire system. He paused, glanced at Bradley, then back at the jury, adding, "If we let him escape responsibility, we agree to let justice be insulted in its own house." The words rocked the room. Many clenched the arms of their chairs, some nodded in solemn agreement. Bradley sat at the defendant's bench, his large frame suddenly seeming small. His head hung low, hands trembling as they clutched his thighs, but there was no strength left in them. His face turned pale, veins pronounced across his forehead, eyes bloodshot and fixed on nothing, as if completely lost. When the presiding judge asked the jury if they had reached a final decision, the room held its breath, the air so tight no one dared move. The jurors exchanged short nods, then the foreperson stood and spoke, voice steady and clear, each word like a nail driven into Bradley's ears. "We unanimously find the defendant guilty." The words rang through the courtroom, unleashing a wave of emotion. Some broke into tears, others shouted, chairs scraped against the floor, and applause erupted like thunder. Bradley heard every word, and his face collapsed, shattered like a statue, long cracked and finally broken. His shoulders slumped, head buried in his hands, and the pride that once shielded him vanished, leaving only a pathetic shadow stretched under the cold white lights. Deep lines cut across his forehead, lips quivering as if to speak, but no sound came out. The presiding judge slammed the gavel, silencing the noise in the courtroom, declaring that the official sentencing would be announced soon. But for everyone present, this moment was already the end for a man who once believed he stood above the law. The guilty verdict not only ended Bradley's career, but also reaffirmed that justice still existed, even if deeply wounded. In the eyes of the hundreds watching, anger slowly turned into relief, as if after days of suffocating tension, they could finally breathe again. And in that moment, the image of Evelyn Carter standing proud returned clearer than ever in their minds. A reminder that some people are willing to endure pain so that justice can be called by its true name. Outside the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the crowd that had waited for hours erupted the instant the verdict was heard. Cheers rang out, waves of people packed the square in front of the courthouse, raising banners, high chanting in unison, "Justice for Evelyn." The sound swelled into a wave, crashing against the courthouse's old walls, shaking the once quiet space. Phones lifted all at once. Live streams rolled out, and the verdict spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the hashtag Justice for Evelyn soared to the top of every platform, dominating national trend. Posts flooded in from citizens, politicians, scholars, and artists, all echoing the same voice. The crowd wasn't just celebrating a legal victory, they were witnessing a historic moment where justice was sealed by blood, tears, and the resilience of one person. The sound of cheering slipped through the courtroom doors, syncing with the pounding hearts of those inside. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her seat, eyes gently closed. Fatigue still lingered on her face, but a rare calm curled at the corners of her lips. In that brief moment, She allowed herself to relax, not for a personal triumph, but because she felt the pain she had carried start to shift into something warm. That warmth didn't stop with her. It spread to those around her like a flame caught in the wind bursting into life. It lit a fire of belief in young students and families who had long endured injustice, in those who once bowed their heads in fear, but now stood tall and shouted outside. Evelyn drew a deep breath, listening to the noise outside like a song written by the people, a song born from unity. In that moment, she knew her suffering had not been in vain, that every drop of blood and every tear had become a vital piece in awakening collective strength. She opened her eyes, gazed soft yet steady looking toward the jury, then to the lawyers and to the many unfamiliar faces now bound together by a shared belief. The courtroom doors swung open, and the sound from the square rushed in like a strong wind carrying cheers, songs, and tears of joy. People crowded forward, reaching their hands toward Evelyn as she stepped out, not to touch her, but to offer their respect, as if greeting a symbol rather than a person. Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, her lips moving without words. But in her heart she understood the flame of justice was no longer hers alone. It had been passed to the community now burning with life outside. And from that moment on, that flame would keep burning far beyond the boundaries of a courtroom, spreading like fire in the wind, unstoppable. That night, the city's central square glowed with candlelight, hundreds of tiny flames flickering in the wind, forming a golden sea stretching all the way to the steps. People stood shoulder to shoulder, regardless of age, gender, or skin color, all joining hands in one large circle, firm like a wall guarding the newly lit flame of belief. Above them, banners hung everywhere. The words, "No one above the law," clearly visible in the wavering light, a declaration that no one, no matter what uniform they wear, can stand above the law. The chant echoed from hundreds of voices, forming a steady rhythm that carried through the dark surrounding streets, turning the once quiet night into something vividly alive. Among the crowd, children held their parents' hands, wide eyes gazing at the banners above and the flickering candles. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and softly asked, "Even a judge can get hit?" The innocent question rang out in the packed square, causing many nearby adults to pause. The mother bent down, hugged her child, and replied, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "Yes, sweetheart, and that's why we're here, to make sure justice is never lowered." That simple answer struck a chord, prompting people to glance at one another, and then up at the dark sky where candle flames still flickered like stars drawn near to the earth. Small conversations began to ripple through the crowd. A gray-haired man told a group of young people beside him that he had witnessed many covered-up incidents before, but this was the first time he had seen the community rise with such force. A young woman nodded, her voice steady. "If even a judge can be treated like that, then we must protect ordinary people even more so. No one feels alone in the face of injustice." Every word was like a spark passing from one to the next, making the atmosphere even more intense, more urgent, and deeply felt. Around the square's corners, makeshift wooden signs were planted into the ground, bearing phrases in many languages from "Justice belongs to everyone" to "Dignity cannot be silenced." Each phrase was more than a slogan. It was a collective oath that from this day on, the city would not let justice be buried. Music rose from a group of street performers, the raw strumming of guitars blending with gravelly but emotional voices, turning the square into a stage for unity. The songs rose into the air, merging with the chants, creating a scene both fierce and sacred, making everyone feel they were living in a historic moment. On the rooftops surrounding the square, families opened windows, hanging down white cloths or stringing lights to join the candlelight below. Some elderly people who couldn't come outside sat by the windows, quietly looking down at the sea of people, their hands trembling as they held their own small candles, participating in the collective declaration. The city seemed to lose all boundaries between indoors and the street, between individuals and the community, as everything blended into one. That night, the candles didn't just light up the square, they reignited a belief that had long been shaken. Each person felt like part of a change that didn't come from speeches on grand stages, but from the steps they took onto the streets, from the hands they clasped tightly. This city, once accustomed to silence, had learned to speak, and when hundreds of voices joined together, the light of justice was no longer an abstract idea, but something real and present, blazing like fire in the wind, spreading through every alley, every street, reaching the hearts of all who were there. After the night, the square lit up with candlelight, and the city's once quiet streets came alive in a different way. The next morning, across neighborhoods, small coffee shops, public libraries, and even inside old churches, people began gathering in groups to talk. Community discussions sprang up everywhere without being called for, as if the event had struck a deep chord already within each person. On long wooden tables hastily set up outdoors, plastic chairs were arranged in circles, and young and old sat side by side sharing their thoughts. They didn't avoid the topic, didn't use vague words, faced the question head on. How do we make sure this city never sees another slap like that? One meeting took place in an old apartment block in a narrow, cramped hallway, yet people still crowded in, leaning against the walls to listen to one another. A single mother spoke, recounting the time her son was stopped just because of his skin color, and her story moved many to tears. A young man stood up, voice trembling but firm, saying that if the community kept silent, this wound would only grow deeper. These weren't just expressions of outrage anymore, they became calls to action. One by one, people realized they were the pieces that made up a larger force. Elsewhere in the city, inside small cafes, students gathered around tables, reading the news and sharing perspectives. They didn't just discuss the incident. They spoke of historical injustices, of the responsibility of their generation. One person wrote on a whiteboard, "Justice does not come from silence," and the group signed their names below as a pledge. In the library, conversations were recorded and archived as material for future generations to hear the voices of this moment in time. It wasn't just citizens, teachers brought the story into classrooms, turning it into a topic for students to debate. Kids who had only heard about it on the news were now asked directly by their teachers, "If one day you witness injustice, what will you do?" The first answers were hesitant, but gradually became stronger, showing a growing awareness taking root. From these small classrooms, the seeds of resistance and collective responsibility were being planted, waiting to grow into something powerful. The truth that once stunned the entire city had now become the catalyst for people to look inward. What used to be avoided was now brought into the light, and the more it was discussed, the more people realized that change was not just a hope, but a necessity. That event acted like a giant mirror, forcing everyone to examine the face of their community to see the cracks and the damage, and then find a way to heal them together. From what seemed like a spontaneous act of violence, the city learned a bigger lesson: how to stand together. People no longer saw themselves as isolated individuals, but as part of a shared current. They understood that when one person is humiliated, everyone is hurt, and only by speaking up together, walking the streets together, lighting candles together, could they protect the values they all held dear. The light of that unity crept through every street, illuminating corners that had long remained in silence. The city changed, not through slogans painted on walls, but through the way people held each other's hands, turning pain into strength and injustice into a reason to move forward together. In the large lecture hall of a university, white light from the projector filled the space, replaying vivid scenes from the trial, each tense moment captured clearly. Every student watched closely, some tilting their heads to take notes, others clenching their fists, eyes gleaming with focus. The video clips showed Evelyn Carter standing tall, blood on her lip, but pride in her gaze. The prosecutor delivering his firm conclusion, the jury declaring the verdict, turning dry legal theory into a living reality before their eyes. The air in the hall grew hotter by the minute. Whispers and murmurs spread through the rows like a low roar, making the room feel like a miniature square where justice was up for discussion and defense. A group of students in the front row began debating passionately, voices overlapping. One young man raised his voice, saying he never thought a judge could become a victim, and that realization made his generation's responsibility feel heavier. A girl beside him nodded her eyes, fierce, whispering, "We can't Stay silent or everything bad will happen again." Her words were met with agreement from those around her, and from that spark, a stronger wave of resolve surged through the room. Midway down the hall, a female student in a white shirt suddenly stood up, her voice clear and loud enough to silence the room. "If justice is disrespected, we will be the ones to protect it." It wasn't scripted, not a speech, but a cry from a burning heart. Her declaration lit a flame in the hall, igniting every eye fixed on her. For a moment, the room held its breath, then erupted into thunderous applause that echoed on and on like a collective vow. The professor on the podium smiled, his aging eyes filled with pride. He looked out at his hundreds of students and knew they had absorbed something no textbook could fully teach: the courage to confront injustice. He said softly, "Today's lesson didn't come from the syllabus. It came from life itself, and you will be the ones to write what comes next." His words fueled their sense of purpose, reminding them they weren't just studying to pass exams, but to carry part of society's burden. The discussion roared back to life, young faces glowing with passion. Some said they would pursue law to protect the vulnerable, others aimed to be journalists, to bring truth to light, and some chose paths in activism. They no longer saw the case as a distant story, but as the starting point of their own journey. Each promise, each commitment voiced in that lecture hall became a thread woven from Evelyn's gaze, from the blood that was shed, to restore the belief that justice belongs to everyone. The light from the projector remained bright, casting over youthful faces full of determination. In that moment, the lecture hall was no longer just a classroom, but a place where a new generation passed the flame to one another. A flame lit by pain, but now turned into strength, carried forward so their paths ahead would no longer repeat the darkness of the past. The city had changed, and now the seed of that change had taken root in the hearts of the youth, those who would rise whenever justice was trampled. Applause erupted across the hall, starting with a few hands in the front row and quickly spreading like waves down the long wooden benches. Within moments, the room exploded with a roaring sound, powerful and sustained like a collective oath from hundreds of young people. It didn't sound like ordinary praise, but like a heartbeat's drum pounding in unison, echoing and synchronized, forming a collective force so dense it felt like it might burst. On the podium, the elderly professor stood silent, his eyes filled with emotion, not interrupting, because he knew this moment no longer belonged to him, but to the awakened spirit of the next generation. Many students stood up still, clapping, shouting short but powerful words, "Justice, dignity for Evelyn." The chants echoed, blending with the applause, making the whole hall shake like a small earthquake. There were tearful eyes, smiles through the tears, because they had just felt a sacred passing of the torch, where the story was no longer just a legal lesson, but a reminder of generational responsibility. Among the crowd, the same young woman who made the earlier vow still stood tall. Fists clenched her face, solemn, but eyes burning bright like a torch, leading the way. The projected image held the frame of Evelyn Carter, in court blood on her lips, but pride in her gaze. That image etched itself into each student's memory like a mirror, reflecting courage. Amid the thunderous applause, many whispered that Evelyn's fire had passed beyond courtroom walls, beyond the city, and reached this place where they now sat in lecture halls, preparing for life. The firm nods of those young faces became a silent acceptance, a wordless affirmation that they were ready to carry the weight. As the applause softened into a steady rhythm, the atmosphere didn't lose its intensity, but instead sank in deeper. The lecture hall felt like a single body breathing together, sharing one unified belief. That solidarity didn't come from a slogan, but from the genuine emotion sparked by Evelyn's sacrifice and pride. Many students captured the moment with their phones, not to post on social media, but to preserve it as a memory, a reminder that they had witnessed the day the flame was passed to their generation. The professor stepped down from the podium, quietly blending into the rows of seats, placing a hand on a young student's shoulder, his eyes filled with trust. He knew what Evelyn had begun would not end in a courtroom or a public square, but would be continued by these hands, these minds and hearts burning with passion. "This is your moment," he said softly, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear, and the words spread like a gentle command, urging the young to move forward. The hall gradually settled, but the fire inside remained. Students packed up their books, but their eyes stayed fixed on the screen, where Evelyn Carter still stood as an unshakable symbol. Each person who stepped through the doors carried a flame in their heart, one lit by the pride and pain of a black judge now turned into a guiding light for the next generation. And from that moment, no one doubted that this flame would keep burning, spreading wide, until one day they too would stand to protect justice as Evelyn once did. In the quiet space of the university library, soft light spilled over rows of shelves, newly stocked with crisp books, the scent of fresh pages mixing with aged wood to create an atmosphere of reverence. On the upper shelf, standing out among volumes on law, politics, and society, a book titled "The Judge Who Stood Tall" was placed with care, its cover showing Evelyn Carter standing upright in the historic courtroom. The book's arrival quickly drew the attention of students who gathered around, passing it from hand to hand, not just reading it as assigned material, but as if they were engaging with a living symbol of pride. In the early chapters, the author detailed Evelyn's journey from the slap that shook a system to the moment she stood and declared her identity, and how that truth transformed the trial. Students read and debated right at the study tables, their voices low but full of energy, many faces lit with emotion. One young man tapped the book's cover and quietly said, "This isn't just a story to remember, it's a compass for us." That simple remark echoed the collective feeling of a generation discovering not just facts, but direction within its pages. It wasn't just students, journalists, and scholars repeatedly cited the book in articles, lectures, and research. In print, Evelyn Carter's image appeared beside bold commentary, comparing her to a historical proof of courage. A scholar from Europe wrote that Evelyn turned pain into legacy, while an American journalist declared her a living witness to justice rising from the wreckage. These statements went beyond admiration, helping solidify her as a landmark figure where legal and social history had been reshaped by the power of one person. In classrooms, professors began adding "the judge who stood tall" to official curricula. Lecturers no longer read aloud distant cases, but instead dissected scenes the whole world had watched unfold. They projected footage of Evelyn in court, prompting students to compare book and film memory and lesson, turning each session into a dynamic conversation. The boundary between theory and reality vanished because that very image served as a constant reminder. Justice isn't abstract. It's something to be defended every single day. In a quiet corner of the library, students sat for hours with the book, jotting notes into their notebooks, some pausing for a long time on the page, quoting Evelyn, "Dignity cannot be measured by skin color." That line was copied down, pinned to personal corkboards, becoming a quiet source of encouragement. That image showed that Evelyn's legacy didn't just live in the courtroom, the square, or the lecture hall, but now existed on every page, in every heart. It carried the message that courage might disappear for a moment, but once written down, it lives forever in collective memory. The city had changed, and now, in the peaceful space of the library, one could still hear the echoes of those turbulent days. Each time a student turned a page, the soft rustle of paper sounded like a whisper from history, reminding them that some people dared to stand tall, dared to endure, so the next generation could move forward. And Evelyn Carter, through her own actions, left behind a permanent legacy, one not touched by hands, but by the minds and hearts of those who seek justice. From the pages of books into daily life, art quickly found Evelyn Carter's story to be an endless source of inspiration. In small galleries downtown, large-format paintings were hung with care, capturing the moment of the fateful slap from different perspectives. One depicted Bradley's hand striking out from the shadows, contrasted by the blazing light in Evelyn's eyes, while another showed her standing tall with the words scribbled below, "Dignity never bows." Red, white, and black blended together to create a visual pull that dragged viewers back to that moment, making them relive its breathless, fierce intensity. People crowded in to see, many standing silently for minutes in front of a canvas, even moved to tears, because Evelyn's image was no longer just a character, it had become a symbol. Music was no exception to this movement. Many young singers and songwriters created tracks inspired by the story, blending modern beats with powerful lyrics. On street stages, the chorus rang out. She stood tall, we rise, with her turning melody into a shared chant. Small performances drew crowds by the hundreds where voices joined in and hands clapped in rhythm as a way to carry on Evelyn's pride. Not long after these recordings surfaced on streaming platforms, climbing charts, proving that music could reach hearts even where books and articles had yet to go. Cinema and documentaries continued to build upon that legacy. Filmmakers from around the world came to the city, interviewing witnesses, capturing images of the square lit with candles, the community discussions, and especially the moment Evelyn stood in court. The footage wasn't overly staged, it simply recorded the truth, but that truth alone was powerful enough to move millions. Many documentaries were screened at international film festivals, and audiences in distant countries stood and applauded after watching because they realized the message was no longer confined to a single nation. Justice, dignity, and courage are shared values anyone could see a part of themselves in that story. Gradually, Evelyn's legacy transcended the boundaries of a legal case. It was no longer just a milestone in American legal history, but a lesson for humanity. From Africa to Asia to Europe, people spoke of her as proof that truth can be trampled but still rise and shine. Schools incorporated her story into civics lessons. Human rights organizations quoted her name in petitions, and international speakers often referred to Evelyn Carter as a lighthouse in an age of chaos. Whenever her name was mentioned, people didn't just remember a judge who was slapped, they remembered someone who turned pain into a global legacy. Discussions at major forums often ended with the question, how will we stand like Evelyn? That question went beyond symbolism, becoming a compass for action. People realized her story wasn't meant just to be retold, but to remind them that change always begins with one courageous act. That legacy, once ignited, is no longer bound by borders or time, but will live on in the memory of humanity, like a flame that never dies, so that anyone walking through darkness can find light. The jail was soaked in damp cold, the dim yellow light hanging from the ceiling casting down onto Bradley's bruised face, exposing every purple blotch and scratch in haunting detail. He sat curled up on the rusty iron bed, hands clutching his head, eyes blankly staring into the darkness ahead. In the thick silence, memories surged back like an old film reel, dragging him to that fateful moment. He remembered with painful clarity the sensation of his hand striking down the sharp crack of skin meeting skin, and immediately after the horrified stir across the courtroom. That sound felt like a wave swallowing him whole, crashing from all directions, suffocating him, and now in the darkness of his cell, it echoed again, over and over, impossible to escape. Bradley clenched his teeth, trying to block out the memories, but it was no use. The horrified faces, the furious stares, the screams, the scraping of chairs and desks in the courtroom all appeared vividly before him. They pressed in on him, turning into a burden that weighed heavily on his shoulders, making him realize the hands once seen as symbols of authority were now the very proof of brutality. He raised those hands trembling, and saw the veins bulging beneath the darkened skin hands that once proudly held up a badge, now shaking like a condemned man's. He squeezed his eyes shut, but instead of peace, he saw even more clearly the blazing eyes of Evelyn Carter, eyes that cut through every excuse and left a wound in his mind that would never heal. In a moment of weakness, he muttered under his breath, voice hoarse and thick in his throat, "Why did everyone turn away?" The words fell out weightless, but the thick walls around him responded only with cold silence. No comrades left to defend him. No more laughter in the break room. no one waiting for him out there. Loneliness engulfed everything, like the suffocating dark. The only sound that remained was the drip of water from a leaking pipe, each drop falling onto the tile floor like a slow reminder that time was still moving while he was trapped in the past. Bradley turned to the wall beside him, pressed his palm against the freezing cement, and felt the emptiness within himself. He once believed power could shield him forever, that the shining gold badge was strong enough to crush any accusation. But now, within the four walls of a jail cell, the badge was just a rusted memory, forgotten by everyone, his name no longer spoken with authority. He collapsed forward, letting his heavy breath echo across the cell, eyes wide open into the darkness. And in that darkness, for the first time, Bradley understood that regret, when it arrives, is not loud but silent, and its weight can crush a man completely. In the damp prison cell, Bradley sat slumped, eyes wide open, staring into the void as memories flooded in like a tidal wave. Every fragment of the past he had tried to forget now returned clearer and more brutal than ever. He saw again the pale faces of young black men. He had stopped for no reason on the street, remembered the choking cries of a boy shoved to the ground just for asking why he was being searched, and the fearful eyes of residents in poor neighborhoods whenever he showed up. Back then, Bradley saw it all as victory, as milestones affirming his power. But now, sitting in his cell, those abuses returned like spreading scars that couldn't be washed away, clinging to his mind, becoming an invisible indictment, echoing in his head every night like a pounding drum. He raised both hands to cover his face, but the darkness offered no escape from the images of his former self. Everything he had done, everything he once relished, now turned into revulsion, making him shudder just thinking about it. Those he had humiliated might have forgotten him, but their silence only made his isolation more profound, because the truth was that no one wanted to remember him as a person anymore. He felt like nothing more than a name tied to disgrace, a shadow rejected by society. Every small sound in the prison rang out like judgment, the guard's footsteps passing by the clank of metal locks, all reminders that he had no power left, no one feared or respected him anymore. Bradley clutched his head, cold, sweat trickling down, mumbling meaningless words as if trying to justify himself, but every attempt dissolved into hopeless silence. For the first time in his life, he no longer had confidence in his own voice, because he knew no one wanted to hear it. Then, like a cold blade, the thought of Evelyn returned. He remembered her eyes in court, blazing with pride, and how her pain had not brought her down, but had instead caused an entire society to rise. Bradley shivered, realizing that the slap that day had not only drawn blood at the corner of her mouth, but had ignited a fire that burned down his entire career and life. He regretted it, but the regret came only after every door had already shut. In the darkness of the prison, Bradley came to a painful truth. Justice had spoken, not through the words of an old judge, not through the jury's verdict, but through the outrage and strength of the community. The cry of justice for Evelyn still echoed in his mind, a reminder that his actions had gone beyond a personal mistake. They had become a symbol of defeated abuse of power. Regret now filled every corner of his mind, but he knew it was too late, because the verdict was not just written in court records, it was etched into the memory of millions. A lasting reminder that justice may be challenged, but it is never conquered. In the vast auditorium of the graduation ceremony, the morning sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, shining down on the neat rows of seats where hundreds of students in gowns waited for their sacred moment. The air, already filled with laughter and congratulations, suddenly quieted as a young black woman stepped onto the stage. In her hands was a carefully framed photo of Evelyn Carter, and the light from the window illuminated the image as if her face were glowing. The girl placed the photo on the wooden podium, took a deep breath, and spoke, her voice clear and strong, breaking the silence. "We will carry on the path she opened." That sentence echoed not just a personal declaration, but the voice of an entire generation seated below, a generation carrying the memory of a historic trial and a flame of justice that has never gone out. A moment of silence filled the space. Then, as if guided. The entire hall stood up. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor erupted in unison, immediately followed by thunderous applause. The echo bounced off the high walls, roaring like drums, rhythmic and powerful, shaking the auditorium. Hands clapped non-stop, growing more intense by the second, joined by cheers and short chants rising from the rows of seats, turning the moment into a collective oath. On stage, the young woman stood tall, her eyes bright, unwavering because she knew she was no longer alone. An entire generation stood with her, sharing the responsibility passed down from Evelyn. Amid that resonance, many faces in the crowd were streaked with tears. Some students gripped each other's hands. Some parents leaned on their children's shoulders, their eyes shining with faith. The applause was no longer a simple ritual of praise, but the heartbeat of a united body, a heartbeat affirming that the legacy had been received, that the path of justice would not end with one trial, one city, but would continue to stretch outward with every step taken by the new generation. On the raised platform, the dean of the law school stood behind them, his eyes red, but his face smiling as he nodded at the student holding the microphone. He understood that this was a historic moment for the institution, a moment when Evelyn Carter's lesson no longer lived in a syllabus, but in the actions and words of the students. The sunlight beyond the windows seemed to shine brighter, casting a glow onto Evelyn's framed photo resting neatly on the podium, making it feel as though everyone in the hall could see a quiet smile from the woman herself. The applause still hadn't stopped. It echoed on like a driving drumbeat, like a promise spoken not through words but through heartbeats. And on that radiant morning, everyone present understood that Evelyn Carter had left behind a message that would never fade. Justice is a flame to be passed on, and now that flame rests firmly in the hands of the next generation. In the moment when the auditorium still echoed with applause, Michael Carter sat silently in the front row. He didn't need to say a word, for his presence alone carried the weight of a living witness to the journey Evelyn left behind. His hand rested gently over the old scar on his chest, a reminder not only of physical pain once endured, but of the memories from a time full of storms. The lines etched deep in his face, yet his eyes were full of belief, glowing like a flame that had been reignited after seeming near extinction. He watched the young woman standing on stage, then looked out across the hall to the youthful faces held high. In that gaze, Michael saw Evelyn's presence not through the photo on the podium, but in the unyielding spirit now passed on to the next generation. The sunlight beyond the window kept streaming into the hall, lighting up every face, every glance. No one said it out loud, but all could feel this wasn't just a graduation ceremony. It was a milestone where a new legacy had taken form. Evelyn Carter had transcended the symbolic death of a slap to become immortal in collective memory. Her story had now passed beyond the boundaries of a city, a nation, to become a compass for anyone confronting injustice. Michael understood that better than anyone, for he himself had once crumbled in the darkest moments, and it was Evelyn's resilience that helped him rise again. The atmosphere in the auditorium slowly quieted, but that quiet was not an end. It was the moment when everyone truly grasped the meaning of the story. Evelyn had proven through blood and dignity that justice never bows to power. Every round of applause, every shining eye in that ceremony was a continuation, a vow that her legacy would not be buried. And in that silence, the truth was once more affirmed. Like a bell tolling across generations, truth cannot be slapped down. Michael gently closed his eyes, letting the memories flood back from the day he pushed Evelyn's wheelchair over the cold courthouse threshold to the moment she stood up and faced her abuser. It all felt like yesterday, but had now become an eternal symbol. When he opened his eyes, looking out at the sunlit auditorium, he knew that path no longer belonged only to Evelyn or to their family. It had become the path of a whole community, a whole generation. The story closes, but its echo lingers. From the drop of blood at the corner of one woman's mouth, a city, a country, and then the world awakened to learn how to stand together. Evelyn Carter left behind an everlasting message. Justice does not fall before tyranny, and truth will always endure, no matter how many hands try to silence it. And as new generations continue to walk forward, that legacy will be the lamp lighting the way, a reminder that justice may be challenged, but it is never defeated. In that radiant ceremony, as Michael Carter sat quietly in the front row, his hand resting on the scar as if to touch again everything he and Evelyn had endured, the story seemed to close but also opened into a wider journey. From a slap that seemed merely an act of humiliation in a courtroom, a city, a country, and then the world was awakened. People found strength in unity. Students found purpose in the light of justice, and those who once stayed silent learned how to speak up. The moment Evelyn stood tall in court, proudly declaring her true identity, it no longer remained a personal event, but became a symbol for a generation that knows how to fight and preserve dignity. That journey passed through many stages, from candlelit squares to lecture halls, ablaze with resolve from quiet libraries, preserving each page, to meeting rooms of international organizations. Every place that touched this story echoed differently, yet all pointed to one truth: justice is not a gift handed down from above, but the result of persistence, courage, and solidarity. Evelyn Carter did not just leave behind the memory of pride through pain, but left a model for all generations on how to transform injustice into a foundation for human worth. Bradley, the man who once believed power lay in his hands, was ultimately left in solitude, locked behind cold walls with late-coming regret. It stands as proof that abuse and prejudice not only harm others, but also destroy those who wield them. His scars will never wash away a lasting warning that anyone who uses power to crush others will soon face isolation and judgment from the very society they once sought to dominate. In contrast, Evelyn, with eyes blazing in the courtroom, proved that true strength lies in dignity, in resolve, in the ability to remain standing, even in moments of deepest humiliation. The greatest lesson from this story does not lie in the verdict for a wrongdoer, but in the collective transformation. When children asked their parents, "Can a judge be hit too?" and parents answered with faith that the law must protect everyone, that moment planted the seed of justice in the next generation. When a young woman stood in a lecture hall and declared she would defend justice, and the entire room burst into applause, the flame was officially passed on. From that moment, Evelyn Carter's legacy no longer belonged to a single case, but became part of human history. The story closes with the image of Evelyn's photograph glowing under the sunlight of the graduation ceremony, but the legacy she left behind continues to live on in every action, every decision made by the next generation. It serves as a reminder that justice cannot be defeated by a slap, truth cannot be buried under prejudice, and human dignity remains the highest value. When a community learns to hold hands, when each individual understands that their voice matters, no power is strong enough to silence justice. And it is within that unity that Evelyn's legacy will continue to burn bright, lighting the way for those still struggling in the shadows of injustice, to remind them that justice, though challenged, will always stand tall and never fall.